A millionaire found a homeless mother and her baby in the forest. What he saw shattered his heart. Alexander strode through the dense forest, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly against the undergrowth, sharply contrasting with the rugged wilderness around him. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the faint chirping of hidden birds blending into a blanket of silence. Towering trees, their branches heavy with foliage, cast long shadows that twisted and intertwined as the last glimmers of daylight began to fade. Alexander took a deep breath, letting the cool, earthy scent fill his lungs, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that had driven him here in the first place. He had come to the forest to clear his mind, to find a moment's peace after the intense argument with Layla. Their relationship, once so promising, had become strained in recent months, full of quiet resentments and hidden frustrations. Tonight's fight had been different, though, a culmination of unspoken words that finally burst forth in harsh accusations and anger. In his frustration, he had grabbed his coat and left, driving until he found this place, hoping the silence and solitude would offer some relief. Lost in thought, Alexander barely noticed how far he'd wandered from the road where his car was parked. He was about to turn back when a faint sound drifted through the stillness, a soft, plaintive cry. He froze, listening, trying to identify the sound amid the distant rustling leaves. It came again, louder this time, a desperate, heart-wrenching cry that sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't place it immediately, but the raw vulnerability in that sound struck something deep within him. Curiosity and concern stirred him to move forward, pushing aside a low-hanging branch. The cry grew closer, and he realized it was unmistakably the sound of a baby. But who would bring a baby into the woods at this hour? Alexander's brows knit together as he cautiously moved forward, navigating around thick roots and low bushes, until he spotted something out of place among the shadows. A small figure, crouched low and clutching something tightly. He took a step closer, and the figure jerked, clutching the bundle even closer, her face half hidden in shadow. She was young, perhaps barely out of her teens, with hollow cheeks and weary eyes that darted nervously as he approached. Her clothes were tattered and dirt-streaked, her hair tangled and unkempt, a testament to days, if not weeks, spent in hardship. The baby in her arms was bundled in a threadbare, dirt-smudged blanket, and Alexander could see the little one's small hands peeking out, trembling slightly as if from cold or fear. The woman's wide eyes fixed on him, her expression a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Alexander held his hands up, trying to appear non-threatening. "Hey," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Do you need help?" For a long, tense moment, she didn't respond, only holding the baby tighter as if she feared he might snatch it away. But as Alexander took in her haunted expression, a pang of sympathy tugged at him. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days, her eyes dark-rimmed, her lips chapped, and her skin bearing the unmistakable marks of exhaustion and malnourishment. Her silence was heavy, the kind that spoke of distrust built from countless betrayals. As he observed her, something else caught his attention, a peculiar, small, crescent-shaped mark on the baby's cheek. The sight jolted him, and a memory surged forward, something so personal that it made his heart skip. He too bore the same crescent birthmark, in the exact spot, a small quirk of nature he'd always thought unique to him. His hand moved instinctively to touch his own cheek, feeling the faint ridge under his fingers, as he stared in disbelief at the mark on the baby. No, he muttered, barely aware he was speaking aloud. It can't be. The woman's eyes widened at his reaction, and she instinctively pulled the baby closer, taking a step back. Fear washed over her, and she looked ready to bolt. No, wait, Alexander said, reaching out, but she backed away. Her breaths shallow and rapid, like a hunted animal cornered with no escape. Please, she whispered, her voice raw and barely audible. Just don't call the police. The vulnerability in her words softened him, and he dropped his hand, not wanting to push her any further. I won't, he promised, keeping his tone gentle. I just need to understand. Who are you? Why does he look like me? But before he could get any further, she stumbled back, her grip on the baby loosening as she tried to put more distance between them. It happened so fast that Alexander barely had time to react. Her foot caught on a root and her balance faltered, her grip slipping. The baby began to fall, and Alexander lunged forward with reflexes he didn't know he had, his arms reaching out to catch the infant before it could hit the ground. He pulled the baby close, his heart pounding with the adrenaline and shock of the moment. The little one let out a soft whimper, nestling instinctively into his arms, and Alexander's own heartbeat slowed as he held the child, marveling at how right it felt. He glanced back at the woman, who stood frozen, her face stricken with a mixture of relief and something else, a deep, overwhelming sorrow that made her look even younger than she was. The baby was safe, but Alexander's mind raced with questions. His gaze returned to the woman, a silent plea for answers written across his face. She met his eyes, her own glistening with unshed tears, but the answer she finally gave only deepened the mystery. He's not mine, she said, her voice breaking. I was forced. Please don't make this harder. Alexander's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean, forced by who? What's going on? But she said nothing more, her silence heavy and filled with unspoken pain. And before he could stop her, she turned, stumbling into the darkness of the forest, her silhouette fading among the shadows cast by the trees. The baby stirred in his arms, his small, innocent face framed by the ragged blanket, and Alexander felt a fierce protectiveness surge within him, a need to shield this child from whatever dark secrets lay behind the woman's cryptic words. He called after her, his voice ringing out in the silence, but she didn't turn back. She moved as if the forest itself swallowed her, each step a retreat into some hidden place where he could not follow. For a moment, he stood there, torn between following her and staying with the child, his mind a tangle of unanswered questions. But then, just as she was nearly out of sight, she tripped over a hidden root, her body pitching forward in a graceless tumble. The baby slipped from Alexander's grasp in his attempt to reach her, and for an agonizing second, it seemed like time itself held its breath. The child fell, his small form fragile and vulnerable, and Alexander's heart nearly stopped in his chest. But then, with a soft, faint cry, the baby let out a small sound, breaking the silence that had wrapped around the forest. Alexander exhaled, relief flooding through him as he crouched down, gathering the child in his arms once more, and gently rocked him until the cries softened into tiny, hiccuping breaths. The world around him seemed to blur as he focused entirely on the baby, his mind still grappling with the strange, inexplicable resemblance, the questions left by the young woman's retreat. But as the baby's tiny fingers curled around his own, Alexander felt something shift within him. At the hospital, Alexander sat in a sterile waiting room with the baby nestled in his arms, his thoughts racing, torn between disbelief and a strange, consuming need for answers. He had come here with no real plan, only a desperate urge to make sure the young woman and the baby were safe. The events in the forest had left him shaken, the image of the woman's haunted eyes lingering in his mind. She was now in the ICU, the doctors having informed him that she had slipped into a coma shortly after being admitted. This only deepened the mystery, and as he looked down at the baby, Oliver, as he had tentatively begun to call him, Alexander felt a strange connection, a pull he couldn't explain. The nurses had given him a few odd looks, noting his designer clothes in contrast with the infant bundled in a ragged blanket. He held Oliver carefully, unsure if the baby even knew him, but something in the child's calm gaze seemed almost familiar. He traced his thumb over the tiny crescent birthmark, lost in thought. What did this mean? Who was the young woman to him, if anything at all? How had she known his name? The questions only grew, piling one on top of another, each one feeling more urgent and unanswerable than the last. Finally, after what felt like hours, a nurse approached, offering him a fresh blanket for the baby and a place to wait until further information was available about the young woman. Alexander gratefully accepted, settling into a quiet room away from the busy corridor. As he tried to soothe Oliver, rocking him gently, his mind kept replaying the moment in the forest when the young woman had whispered his name, her voice trembling with desperation and something else he couldn't quite place. He was deep in thought when the door to the room opened and two police officers entered, their expressions serious. They introduced themselves, explaining they were here to investigate the circumstances surrounding the woman's arrival and the baby's identity. Alexander explained what had happened in the forest, sharing the few details he knew, though every word felt surreal as he said it out loud. One of the officers listened intently, while the other took notes, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Mr. Pierce," one officer said, looking him directly in the eye, "we believe this baby may be connected to a recent incident at a nearby hospital. A newborn was reported missing from the maternity ward about a week ago, and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance are unusual." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner before continuing. "Do you have any prior connection to this child or his mother?" Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. How could he explain the inexplicable resemblance, the birthmark, the connection he felt, even though he'd only met the child hours ago? His mind raced as he struggled to find an answer, but before he could speak, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. Alexander looked up, his breath catching as a familiar figure entered the room. Mia, his ex-girlfriend, stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper, something raw. She looked at him, then at the baby in his arms, her eyes filling with tears as she took a trembling step forward. "Alexander," she whispered, barely able to contain her emotions. That's my baby." The room fell silent, and the officers exchanged glances as Alexander's world seemed to tilt. He looked down at Oliver, then back up at Mia, his mind reeling. He had known Mia for years. They had once shared a deep, intense connection. But their relationship had ended suddenly, leaving behind only unanswered questions and unspoken regrets. Now, here she was, claiming that this child, this baby he had felt so inexplicably drawn to, was her son. As the initial shock wore off, Mia took another step forward, her voice thick with emotion as she began to explain. She told Alexander that the baby, Oliver, was indeed his child, born from a love they had once shared, but forced into secrecy by circumstances beyond their control. Alexander listened in stunned silence as she recounted the series of events that had led her to give up the baby, the pain and confusion that had haunted her ever since. She had been left with no choice, manipulated by people she had once trusted, and now, by a twist of fate, the baby had found his way back to her, through Alexander. Mia took a shaky breath, glancing at the officers as she continued. "Someone took him, Alexander. I didn't know where he was, didn't know if I'd ever see him again. And then they told me he was missing. I was terrified." Alexander's heart raced, and his grip on Oliver tightened as Mia's words sunk in. "But why, Mia? Who would do this to you?" She looked away, swallowing hard before she spoke again. "Grace. She's an old friend of Layla's. We met through her, actually. Grace knew everything. About us, about Oliver. She's the one who convinced me that I had to give him up. But when I tried to see him again, she made sure I couldn't. I thought she was trying to help. But she had other plans." Alexander's mind spun, struggling to process the betrayal, the layers of deception that had unfolded right under his nose. The officers listened intently, taking down every word as Mia explained how Grace had manipulated her, exploiting her vulnerabilities, and orchestrating a scheme to keep her and Alexander apart. Grace had even arranged for the baby to be placed in the hospital under a different name, making it nearly impossible for Mia to find him again. It was a plan rooted in cruelty and control, one that had almost succeeded. The officers, now alert to the gravity of the situation, assured Mia and Alexander that they would look into Grace's involvement. They promised to pursue every lead, to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. The weight of the revelation settled over them all, and Alexander felt a swell of anger and protectiveness, his resolve hardening as he looked at Oliver, at Mia, and the family they had been denied for so long. In the following days, the investigation moved swiftly. The police located Grace, who was brought in for questioning. Evidence began to pile up, and as the story unraveled, it became clear that Grace had not only manipulated Mia, but had actively worked to keep Alexander from ever discovering the truth. She had used her friendship with Layla to gain access to their lives, embedding herself deeply enough to carry out her plan unnoticed. Grace's motivations remained twisted and complex, a strange blend of jealousy, control, and a desire to dismantle the life Alexander might have shared with Mia. The days that followed were filled with emotions, heavy and tangled. Alexander spent hours with Oliver, learning the rhythm of caring for a baby. The sleepless nights, the gentle lullabies, the simple but profound joy of watching his son's face light up with a smile. Mia stayed close, her presence comforting and familiar, as they both navigated the complexities of their newfound roles as parents. In the midst of everything, Layla had distanced herself, unable to reconcile Alexander's love for the child with the life she had envisioned for them. They had a final conversation, a painful but necessary one, in which they both acknowledged that their paths had diverged irreparably. It was a bittersweet ending, the close of one chapter and the beginning of another. Alexander found himself drawn to Mia in ways he hadn't anticipated, old feelings reawakening with a new depth, a new purpose. He saw the love she held for Oliver, the sacrifices she had made, and felt a profound respect for her resilience. Together, they slowly began to rebuild what had been broken, not just for themselves, but for their son. a bond that had been tested by time, distance, and deception, but had endured against all odds. As the weeks passed, Alexander found himself adjusting to a life he hadn't expected, one filled with small, precious moments he had never before valued. One evening, he watched as Oliver took his first tentative steps, his small hands reaching out for balance. Alexander felt a swell of pride, a surge of love so intense that it left him breathless. He turned to Mia, who was watching with a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the same wonder and gratitude he felt. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "Do you believe in new beginnings?" Mia's gaze softened and she nodded, her smile gentle and full of promise. "With you, I think I do." In that quiet moment, they both knew that they were no longer haunted by the shadows of their past. They had emerged from the storm, stronger and more united, ready to build a future together. A family forged from love, resilience, and the strength to start anew. And as they stood there, watching Oliver toddle forward, his laughter echoing through the room, they felt a peace that came from knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. In the months that followed, Alexander and Mia began to settle into a life they had both once believed lost. Each day brought them closer, and the quiet, steady rhythms of family life began to heal wounds that had once seemed unfixable. They took turns caring for Oliver, juggling the demands of their own lives with the unexpected and beautiful responsibility of raising him. For Alexander, this was a world so far removed from the pristine but distant lifestyle he had once embraced. It was filled with laughter, late-night lullabies, the chaotic joy of toddler toys strewn around the house, and Oliver's small, inquisitive eyes observing the world with wonder. Alexander's days began to reflect his new priorities. As the head of his own company, he was used to long hours and constant pressures. But now, things had shifted. His workdays became more purposeful, his time more carefully managed, each decision considered with the knowledge that he had a little boy waiting for him at home. The office, once a sanctuary from the turmoil of his personal life, now felt empty in comparison to the warmth of his evenings with Oliver and Mia. He discovered a new focus in his work, using his resources to support initiatives that helped families in need, often thinking of the struggles Mia had faced in his absence. This shift didn't go unnoticed as his colleagues remarked on the change in him, sensing a newfound compassion and drive that had transformed his once rigid demeanor. For Mia, adjusting to her new life alongside Alexander was both comforting and challenging. She had spent so much time fighting on her own, holding on to hope in the face of betrayal and hardship, that the sudden return of love and support felt almost overwhelming. Yet, day by day, she allowed herself to trust again. The walls she had built around her heart began to soften as she watched Alexander care for Oliver with an intensity and devotion she'd once only dreamed of. Every time she saw him cradle their son, every time he rose in the middle of the night to comfort Oliver's cries, her heart grew a little lighter. She could see that Alexander's love for their child was real, something that had emerged from the pain of the past and forged itself into something solid, enduring, and fierce. There were moments of uncertainty, of course. Their past lay behind them, but its echoes occasionally surfaced, a reminder of the broken path that had brought them here. Alexander still carried some guilt for the years they had lost, the times he had been blind to the manipulations surrounding him. Mia, in turn, wrestled with memories of her own vulnerabilities, the doubts and fears she had learned to live with. But as they faced these shadows together, they found that each challenge only strengthened the bond they were rebuilding, weaving them together in ways that neither could have anticipated. One night, they decided to take Oliver to the small park near their home. It was dusk, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and purple, the fading sunlight casting a gentle glow over the scene. Alexander held Oliver's tiny hand as they walked toward the swings, and Mia followed close behind, smiling as she watched them. They took turns, pushing Oliver gently on the swing, his delighted laughter filling the air as he soared higher and higher, his small arms reaching out as if to touch the sky. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and they were simply a family, caught in the magic of a perfect, ordinary moment. Afterward, they sat on a bench together, Oliver nestled between them, his sleepy head resting on Alexander's shoulder. Mia leaned her head on Alexander's other shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear. It was in these quiet, unspoken moments that Mia felt the strength of their connection, the subtle but undeniable feeling that they were meant to be here, together, despite everything. As they returned home, Alexander found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before. His thoughts wandered to the life he wanted to build with Mia and Oliver, a life where they could leave behind the pain and scars of their past. He began to see a future that was not simply filled with professional success or wealth, but with memories of family dinners, birthdays, first days of school, and lazy weekends spent together. It was a future that filled him with both excitement and peace. One evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Alexander and Mia sat together on the living room couch, their conversation soft and easy. Mia told him stories about her own childhood, her dreams for Oliver, her hopes for a life built on kindness, resilience, and love. She confided in him her fears, the lingering anxieties from the time they had been apart, and Alexander listened with patience and understanding, his hand wrapped around hers in quiet reassurance. As the night wore on, Mia turned to him, a softness in her eyes. "Do you ever wonder how things would have been if we had known the truth from the start?" Alexander looked at her thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I wish I had known. Wish I could have been there for you and Oliver from the beginning. But maybe this is how it was meant to be. We were broken and lost, but we found each other again. And now we get to build something real." Mia smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes the hardest things can bring us to where we're meant to be." They sat in silence for a moment, both absorbing the depth of her words. It was true. Their journey had been fraught with challenges and heartbreak, but in the end, it had led them here, to each other, to Oliver, to a family bound not by circumstance, but by choice and love. One day, they decided to take a short trip to the beach. It was Oliver's first time seeing the ocean, and his reaction was one of pure awe. He toddled across the sand, squealing with delight as the waves lapped at his feet, his small hands grabbing fistfuls of wet sand with curious fascination. Alexander and Mia watched him, their hands entwined, their laughter mingling with Oliver's as they built sandcastles and chased him through the surf. The joy on Oliver's face was contagious, filling them both with a sense of fulfillment they had never known. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the water, Alexander turned to Mia, a serious expression on his face. "Mia," he began softly, "I know we've been through a lot, and I know we still have things to work through. But I also know that I love you. I love you and I love our son. I want us to be together, to share this life, to give Oliver the family he deserves." Mia looked at him, her heart pounding as she took in his words. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability in his voice, and knew that he was offering her more than just words. He was offering her a future, a commitment to the family they had fought so hard to build. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you too, Alexander. I always have. And I want this. I want us, together, as a family." They embraced, a silent promise exchanged between them as the waves crashed gently in the distance, their future unfolding before them, limitless and filled with hope. From that day forward, they began building the life they had always wanted, rooted in trust, love, and the unbreakable bond of family. The months turned into years, and as Oliver grew, so did their family's love. There were challenges, of course, moments of doubt, sleepless nights, times when the past threatened to resurface. But through it all, Alexander and Mia faced each challenge together, always remembering the strength they had found in each other. And every time they looked at Oliver, every time they saw his wide-eyed wonder, his laughter, his joy, they were reminded of the journey that had brought them here, to a life they had never expected, but one they cherished deeply. One evening, years later, Alexander stood on the porch with Mia, watching as Oliver played in the yard, his laughter ringing out as he chased after their new puppy. Alexander wrapped an arm around Mia's shoulders, pulling her close, and she leaned her head against him, a smile on her lips. "Do you remember that night in the forest?" he asked softly, his voice filled with wonder. Mia nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I do. I never thought it would lead to this." Alexander smiled, his gaze full of love as he looked at her. "Neither did I, but I'm grateful every day that it did." They stood together in the fading light, their hearts full, watching as their son played, as their future unfolded, knowing they had found something far greater than they could have ever imagined. A love that had withstood the test of time, a family forged from both heartbreak and healing, and a life filled with the promise of tomorrow.